Pioneer didn't just compete in the monster receiver era. Pioneer started it, and Pioneer ended it. The machine that ended it weighed 78 pounds and pushed 270 watts per channel. It sells for more today than it did new, and it only exists because of a rule the industry never asked for. Every SX receiver of the wattage war, 1974 to 1980, in order. Pioneer bet the flagship on going bigger than anyone else. It worked. It also killed the category. You'd assume a war over watts started with engineers chasing power. It didn't. It started with a government rule written to stop companies from lying. Before 1974, a watt didn't mean anything. Not legally, not on a spec sheet, not in a store. Every company got to invent its own definition, and every company invented a flattering one. Music power, peak power, IHF power, numbers that sounded enormous and described almost nothing. Here's what one of those numbers actually was. Lafayette Radio sold an amplifier called the LR524. The catalog advertised it in music power, and music power meant a burst of a single tone, 1 kilohertz, lasting about 10 milliseconds, a tenth of an eye blink. That was the spec. That was the sales pitch. The Federal Trade Commission ran the math on what shoppers were up against. To turn an advertised power figure into something you could actually use in a living room, the buyer had to knock 10 to 25% off the number, and then divide what was left by 2. Nobody was doing that in a showroom. So on May 3, 1974, the FTC ended it, the amplifier rule. If you wanted to print a power figure in an ad, you now had to earn it. Continuous power, both channels running at once, into 8 ohms, across the whole audible band, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And you had to publish your distortion. Same Lafayette amplifier. Nothing inside it changed. But in the 1975 catalog, the LR524 was listed at 5 watts per channel. 5. But the rule had a second half, and this is the part that built the monsters. Before you measured anything, the amplifier had to survive an hour of preconditioning at 1/3 of its rated power. 1/3 power happens to be the exact worst place you can park a Class AB amplifier, the least efficient point in its operating range, where it throws off the most heat. Amps didn't just struggle. Amps died on the bench before the real test began, which left every manufacturer 2 doors: publish a smaller, honest number, or build a machine strong enough to survive the test. Pioneer picked the second door, and within months of the rule taking effect, the first 100-watt per channel receiver in history was sitting on a dealer's shelf. To understand what Pioneer did in 1974, look at what Pioneer was selling the year before. The SX-A28, a beautiful receiver, well-built, and completely typical of its moment. The brochure promised up to 270 watts of music power. Enough, it said, to fill a room of any size. 270. The actual continuous rating was 54 watts per channel into 8 ohms. Hold on to that number. 270. It comes back at the end of this story, and the second time, it's real. But after May of '74, that brochure was illegal. Putting the word music in front of the word watts stopped working. And suddenly, every manufacturer on Earth had to print a number that a federal engineer could take apart on a test bench. So the question stopped being how much power you could claim. It became how much power you could survive. 100 watts was the wall. And you have to understand why it was a wall. That same year, Pioneer's finest standalone power amplifier, the SA9100, a dedicated box, no tuner, nothing to do but amplify, was rated at 60 watts. 60. A receiver had to cram the radio tuner, the preamp, the phono stage, and the amplifier into one chassis. The receiver was, by definition, the compromise. The convenient choice. The one that traded power for simplicity. Nobody expected the compromise to win. In late 1974, Pioneer shipped the SX1010, 100 watts RMS per channel, into 8 ohms, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, at no more than 0.1% total harmonic distortion, measured under the new standard, the hard one, the one that was killing amplifiers in the lab, the first 100-watt per channel receiver in the world. And it didn't get there on tricks, it got there on iron. Pioneer gave it a dual positive-negative power supply feeding 2 filter capacitors, 18,000 microfarads apiece. The output stage was a direct-coupled, parallel push-pull design with no output capacitor in the signal path. Its ratio of power supply capacitance to output watts was among the highest ever put in a consumer receiver. Rivals would go on to print bigger power figures. Almost none of them would go on to build a power supply like that. It weighed about 50 pounds. It cost $699.95, north of $3,000 in today's money. And it was the last black-faced pioneer. Dark dial, blue backlight, that laboratory instrument look the company was about to walk away from forever. It worked. It worked too well. Because a number you can verify is a number somebody else can beat. Before Pioneer had finished celebrating, Marantz came back with the 2325, 125 watts per channel. Kenwood moved, Sansui moved, Technics moved. Pioneer hadn't won a race. Pioneer had fired the starting gun. And here's the part almost nobody tells you. The wattage war wasn't started by a customer demanding more power. It was started by a rule written to protect that customer. By forcing everyone to tell the truth, the FTC turned power into the one number that could no longer be faked, and therefore the only number worth fighting over. Honesty became a weapon. But a flagship doesn't sell a company. Underneath the SX1010, Pioneer built an entire fleet. And that fleet is the reason that by the middle of the decade, Pioneer sat in more American living rooms than any audio brand on earth. In 1976, Pioneer did something that would sound like commercial suicide today. It threw out the entire lineup and rebuilt it from scratch. Gone was the black dial. Gone was the blue backlight. In came the silver face. Brushed aluminum, walnut side panels, meter needles floating over a lit scale. That look. The look you are currently walking past in a thrift store while somebody asks $2,000 for it. And it wasn't one model. It was a ladder. The SX450 at 15 watts per channel. The SX550 at 20. The SX650 at 35. The SX750 at 50. The SX850 at 65. The SX950 at 85. Look at them in a row. Every rung is a little more power, a little more weight, a little more money. A kid with his first paycheck came in at the 450. 5 years later, he came back for the 750. Pioneer wasn't selling you a receiver. Pioneer was selling you a decade-long shopping habit. The numbers were honest too. The SX850, with its 65 real watts into 8 ohms, was no contender in the war, which is exactly what made it a superb machine. 65 honest watts will drive nearly any two-way or three-way speaker on the market. People didn't need a monster, people wanted one. And that's the trap Pioneer set for itself. Because when you build a ladder, you teach the customer to look up. Every man who bought a 650 spent the next few years staring at the 850. Every 850 owner stared at the 950. The lineup didn't satisfy the hunger for power. It manufactured it. One rung higher sat a room Pioneer had never entered. 120 watts. 160 watts. Numbers that had stopped having anything to do with filling a living room with sound. And to get up there, Pioneer was going to have to stop building consumer electronics and start building something else. In 1976, at the top of that ladder, Pioneer put 2 machines. Most people only remember one of them. Start with the forgotten one, the SX1050. 120 watts per channel, into 8 ohms, 20 Hz to 20 kHz, at no more than 0.1% distortion, 52 pounds, $700. On paper, it reads like the next rung up from the 950. It isn't take the lid off and what's inside doesn't belong to the same family. A toroidal transformer, a huge power supply with a step-start circuit and 2 enormous capacitors, a stepped attenuator volume control, a shielded multi-gang tuning capacitor, a significantly upgraded FM section. The SX1050 is not the big brother of the SX950. It's the little brother of the monster. And with the cover on, you can barely tell them apart, because the monster was standing right next to it. The SX1250, 160 watts RMS per channel, $900 in 1976. Call it $3,700 today. And for the second time in 2 years, Pioneer broke the world record for power in a receiver. Sit with that number for a second. In '74, Pioneer's finest separate power amplifier made 60 watts. 2 years later, a receiver, tuner, preamp, phono stage, all of it in the same box, made 160, nearly triple, in 24 months. That's not product development, that's an arms race. And the SX1250 didn't just meet its number, it beat it. A Macintosh technician at one of the brand's walk-in clinics put one on the bench and watched it clip at 194 watts per channel. 34 watts past the promise. The machine was lying, but it was lying downward. 4 22,000 microfarad capacitors. Point-to-point wiring. Heat sinks the size of bricks. The people who restore these things for a living still say the 50 series was built better than anything that came after it. Now look at the date again. 1976. The FTC rule was 2 years old. 2 years. That's all it took for a law written to humble the industry to produce a $900 160-watt receiver. But Pioneer wasn't alone up there. And this is the part that turns a product story into a war. Marantz answered. Sansui answered. Kenwood answered. And then they stopped answering and started attacking. The Sansui G9000, the Kenwood KR9400, the Marantz 2325, and then the 2385. Every quarter somebody printed a bigger number, and every number forced the next one. Nobody could stop. That's the mechanism. In a wattage war, there is no dignified retreat because the number is printed on the front of the catalog and the customer can read. Stepping off the ladder means admitting, in large type, that you lost. So the machines got fatter. The transformers got fatter. The heat sinks got fatter. The prices got fatter. And the number on the box began peeling away from anything a human being could actually use in a room with walls. One SX1250 owner put it better than any reviewer did. He had 4 HPM 100 speakers wired to it, and he could never push the volume knob past the halfway mark, not for lack of nerve, for fear of destroying the speakers. That's the exact point where the war stops making engineering sense. Nobody was buying sound anymore. They were buying the number. And the moment an entire industry starts selling a number instead of a product, only one question is left. How high can that number go before the machine itself breaks? Technics was about to answer it, and the answer was going to knock Pioneer clean off its own record. In 1977, Technics shipped the SA1000, 330 watts per channel, 90 pounds, 25 inches wide, 22 inches deep. It had stopped being a receiver. It was furniture with a plug. And Pioneer, which had broken the world record twice in 2 years, was looking up at it from 160 watts. That wasn't the only blow. Marantz launched the 2600 at 300 watts. Sansui launched the G222,000 at 220, then the G33000 at 300. Kenwood reached 200 with the KR9050. Hitachi reached 200 with the SR2004. Pioneer had started the war. Suddenly, Pioneer was losing it. And here is where we have to be exact, because there's a myth that has been circling the internet for 20 years, and this channel isn't going to repeat it. A lot of those numbers were lies, not advertising lies, physical lies. The FTC rule required an amplifier to survive a full hour of preconditioning before anyone measured a single watt, and several of those titans could not survive the hour. Their power supplies were monumental. Their heat sinks were not. Measure the machine cold and it hit the catalog figure. Let it get hot and the power began to collapse. The most cited case is the Technics SA1000 itself, 330 watts on paper, unable to pass the 1-hour preconditioning test. And among the great beasts of that era, very few genuinely held their published rating under FTC conditions. The Marantz 2385, 2500, and 2600 are the ones the technical community still recognizes as legitimate. So look at the board again in 1977. The entire industry is printing enormous numbers. Some of those numbers cannot survive the test. The industry itself was forced to accept in '74. A rule written to end the lying had, in 3 years, produced a brand new generation of lies. Except now the lies weighed 90 pounds. And Pioneer had 2 options. It could do the same thing. Print a giant number, bet that nobody would run the machine hot enough to find out, and climb back to the top of the list. Or it could build the real thing. What it did next is the reason that, 45 years later, we are still talking about a Japanese consumer electronics brand as if it were a legend. Pioneer didn't come back with a bigger number. Pioneer came back with the biggest number and the machine that could actually hold it. 1978. Pioneer unveils the SX1980, 270 watts per channel. That number, the same one Pioneer had stamped on the SX828 brochure 5 years earlier, back when 270 meant a 10 millisecond burst, and the machine actually made 54 watts. This time, 270 watts was continuous. Per channel, both channels driven, into 8 ohms, 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz, at no more than 0.03% total harmonic distortion. 0.03. Read that again. The SX1250 ran at 0.1. Receivers sold today work with figures between 1 and 10%. Pioneer didn't just triple the power of its previous flagship, it tripled the power and cut the distortion to a third. 78 pounds. A toroidal transformer that weighs 22 pounds by itself. 88,000 microfarads of capacitance. 6 power transistors per channel. A rated power draw of 1400 volt amperes. Run this thing hard and it drinks a serious share of the electrical circuit feeding an American house. And now the part that kills the myth. Because for 20 years, on audio forums, people have repeated that the SX1980 never made 270 watts, that it really made 145. that it failed the FTC test, and that Pioneer was hit with a cease and desist order for fraudulent advertising. Go find the document. There isn't one. What does exist are the measurements from the time. In September of 1978, Leonard Feldman put the SX 1980 on the bench for Audio Magazine and measured 2.3 decibels of dynamic headroom, meaning that on the short-term signal used for that test, the machine was producing close to 460 watts. That November, High Fidelity's test report went further. They measured the SX 1980 exceeding its rated power, 280 watts at clipping. At 0.015% distortion, 10 watts past the promise, half the distortion it claimed. The SX 1980 didn't fail its number. It beat it, while half the industry was printing figures that couldn't survive an hour switched on. And there's the whole victory, the part that never fit on a catalog page. In a war where lying had become normal, Pioneer won by telling the truth and building the iron to back it up. The same rule that had humiliated the SX 828 in '74 is the rule that crowned the SX 1980 in '78, $1,295, roughly $5,000 today. And today, a restored SX 1980 sells for right about that, or more. 45 years on, the machine hasn't depreciated. It's appreciated. One man who bought an SX 1050 in the '80s and waited almost 4 decades to finally own the 1980 described switching it on this way. He turned it up a little, and a chair went across the room and hit him in the knee. The table lamps went down. He had to screw the pictures into the wall studs. It's an exaggeration. All the good legends are. But the SX 1980 is why the legend exists. It was not the most powerful receiver ever built. The Technics SA1000 had more watts and got there first. And neither Marantz nor Sansui were far behind. The SX 1980 was something rarer than that. It was the one that was true. And it was the last. The SX 1980 went out of production in 1980, and everything went with it. The 80 series shut down. The SX 1280, with its 185 watts, was withdrawn the same year. And no manufacturer, not Pioneer, not Marantz, not Sansui, not Technics, ever built anything like it again. Not once. There was no final battle. There was no winner. The war simply ran out of people, because the numbers had climbed to a place where they didn't do anything anymore. A 78-pound, $1,200 receiver does not solve a single problem a real customer has. Nobody needed 270 watts. They only wanted them. And wanting runs out. What people did need was other things. Smaller homes, cheaper gear, and, just around the corner, a new format that was about to change what listening to music at home even meant. The industry turned around and started building light plastic boxes with printed numbers nobody bothered to check. The monsters didn't lose. They were left alone. This entire war rested on an assumption nobody stopped to question. That if you wanted bigger sound, you needed more watts. And while Pioneer, Marantz, and Technics were tearing each other apart climbing from 100 to 300, there was a man in Arkansas who had spent 30 years proving the whole premise was wrong. His speakers were so efficient that a single watt pushed them past 100 decibels. They never needed a monster, they never did. And his first design, from 1946, is still being built today. That story's on the screen.